Chapter 10. Dangerous Adventure. Delighted with her discovery, Nancy now was intent on finding a container to get a sample from the Dite chemical vats. There must be a bottle here somewhere. Suddenly, beside her shoulder, the girl saw a black widow spider crawling through an open ventilator shaft. In horror, she backed away quickly. Then she killed it with her shoe. I wonder what's on the other side of the ventilator. An idea came to her. Maybe Bushy Trot uses spiders to make silk thread, the way Mr. Booker does. Excited, she looked through the ventilator. It was dark beyond, but Nancy found a switch which lighted the inner room. It was filled with glass cases, but she could not see what was in them. I must find out if they're spiders that spin silk thread, she decided. If so, that will be another bit of evidence against Mr. Dite. Near the ventilator was a door which apparently led to the room. To Nancy's annoyance, it had no knob or visible lock, nor could it be pushed or pulled. It must open by means of a secret spring, she reasoned. With infinite patience, Nancy moved her hand over every inch of the panel. Suddenly, the door swung inward. I must have touched the spring, she thought gleefully. Scarcely had the door closed behind her when she heard footsteps outdoors. Evidently, the night watchman, attracted by the light she had turned on, had come to investigate, but the man did not come in. Doesn't he have a key? Nancy pondered. Or doesn't he suspect an intruder's in here? All the while, Nancy had continued to explore the inner room of the laboratory. She noticed that the cases contained spiders, but they were not the harmless orb weavers like those at the Booker factory. They're deadly black widows, but just as useful for thread, Nancy reflected. Bushy Trot has courage to work with the poisonous things. I wonder what Effie would say to that. Effie! Nancy suddenly recalled her promise to go back to Pleasant Hedges. She glanced at her watch and was startled to see how late it was. I must get a sample of the chemical solution in the other room and then find my way out, Nancy decided. Once more, she pressed against the secret panel and it swung open. Quietly, she returned to the outer room and hunted for an empty container. I know, Nancy chuckled. Why didn't I think of it before? In her pocket were 2 miniature bottles, part of the March collection. She had intended to offer them to Mr. Dite, but in her haste to leave his office, she had forgotten to do so. Though small, each receptacle was provided with a large stopper. Taking care not to wet her fingers with the chemical, Nancy filled the containers from 2 different tanks. Again, she heard footsteps outside the building. What should she do? Turn off the light or leave it on? Nancy decided to leave it on to avoid calling further attention to herself. But I'd better escape as soon as possible, she thought. Then she remembered that Trot had locked all the doors. Recalling that there was another door inside the spidery, she decided to take a chance on that one. Again, she pressed the secret spring and the door opened. As she slid through, Nancy heard the squeal of car brakes outside. Then came the sound of running feet. In panic, Nancy sped to the door at the far end of the spidery. She felt a momentary sense of helplessness when it would not yield, but with an extra tug it opened. A steep flight of steps led downward. As she groped along, Nancy became aware of a cool breeze blowing across her face. That's fresh, clean air, she said to herself, trying to be calm. This cellar must have an outside exit. Inching her way, Nancy followed the stream of air. Not far ahead, she saw a dim patch of light. Stumbling toward it, she came to the entrance of a low tunnel with a tiny electric bulb above it. This must be the way out, she decided. Bending over, Nancy crept along. The tunnel was not long. Soon the floor began to slope at a steep angle. In another dozen yards, Nancy came to a heavy door with a small barred opening in it. The door was not locked from her side, so she opened it without difficulty. After closing the door, which locked itself, she climbed a flight of stone steps to an alley. Free! She congratulated herself. But what a scare! Nancy stood for a moment by the factory wall. Breathing deeply of the night air, she sought to get her bearings. Some distance away, she saw a street lamp and a main thoroughfare. She decided that it must be at the south boundary of the plant. Nancy started forward, but immediately paused. A man had just entered the alley. He held his head so low she could not see his face. His manner of walking, however, was familiar. That's Bushy Trot, she thought in panic. If he catches me here, all of my night's work may be a total loss. Frantic, Nancy looked about for a hiding place in the alley. She did not want to go back to the cellar. Perhaps he won't notice me behind this gasoline drum, she thought hopefully. The alleyway was in deep shadow, lighted only by the far-off street lamp at the entrance. Crouching behind the drum, Nancy waited. The man came nearer and passed within a foot of Nancy, but did not see her. Trot descended to the cellar passageway. A moment later, Nancy heard the dull click of a lock as the heavy door swung shut. Lucky I didn't hide down there, she thought. Now to get home. Out in the street, Nancy got her bearings and headed for the convertible. As she stepped inside, the young detective breathed a sigh of relief. I really must watch my step, Nancy said to herself. In a short time, she reached her own house. Through an unshaded window in the living room, she could see Hannah Gruen talking excitedly to her father. He was pacing the floor nervously. Wonder if they're worried about me, Nancy thought, as she unlocked the front door and hurried inside. Nancy, where have you been? Exclaimed Mr. Drew. Mrs. Gruen was equally relieved. I've been so worried about you. With a great sigh, Nancy dropped to the sofa. Now that the strain was over, she realized how utterly exhausted she was. I've had a perfectly awful experience, she confessed. I was locked in the Dite factory. Locked in? Her father cried. Mr. Dite has a room where he keeps black widow spiders. One of the horrible things was only a few inches from my shoulder, but I'm glad I went there just the same. I shudder to think of your taking such risks to help me, my dear, her father said. Come have dinner and tell me everything. While the housekeeper hurried to reheat Nancy's meal, the young detective removed the tiny bottles of fluid from her pocket and carefully placed them on the table. Here's some of the solution from Mr. Dite's private laboratory. It certainly looks as if he has copied Mr. Booker's method of making the beautiful silk thread. I'll take this sample to Mr. Booker tomorrow, the lawyer exclaimed. If it proves to be the same formula as his, then I can institute proceedings against Mr. Dite. Nancy related her adventure in detail as she ate, then said she had promised Effie she would return to the March mansion for the night. Dad, would you drive me out to Pleasant Hedges? Glad to. Meanwhile, at the March home, Effie was growing more and more alarmed because Nancy had failed to arrive. Every time Effie heard a car on the road, She would listen and wait for it to appear, pressing her face against the window pane and peering out through the dark pines. "Nancy never broke a promise to me before," she told Mr. March. "She knows I'm scared to stay here at night without her." "I'm sure something important came up," he replied. "Better stop worrying." When 10 o'clock came, he retired. Effie decided that it would be futile to wait longer for Nancy. Reluctantly, she went to her room and prepared for bed. "What a dark, gloomy night," the maid observed as she looked out a window. "Not even a moon." Her thoughts on the weather ended abruptly. Beneath the window, she saw a stealthy, indistinct figure move. Someone was creeping along the high, untrimmed hedge which ran beside the wing of the rambling house. End of chapter 10.